Thank you. Thank you for doing this. First of all, I'd love to ask you about your childhood and tell us a bit about your childhood and what were some of the key sort of experiences that shaped who you are.
Well, so I always say that my greatest gift to the world is being able to describe a transition and a maybe a transformation too, of being living on Earth in modern world paradigm, and then being introduced, quite far on into life about another paradigm that human beings also live in. I say, there are human beings all over the world who living in the same place, same element, same sky, same earth, same sea, same same everything, and yet the way that they approach living here as a human being, how they choose to have relationships with this place is so radically different. I grew up here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is the largest city in New Mexico, which is not saying that it's all that large even, but it's the largest one in our state here in the United States. And it was we always call ourselves a tricultural community, and that means European descent, Spanish descent, like literally from Spain, and then also Indigenous, right? And I moved, my father was able to attend university. He got a Ford Foundation fellowship to go to really any school that he could get into, and so in the end he was choosing between Stanford and Harvard, and my mom told him, no, we got to go to California, and I'm really grateful she made that call. I'd be a very different human being if she hadn't made that call, and if I'd ended up at Harvard probably. But anyway, so our family went to live on the Stanford University campus when my father was getting his PhD, and I really feel like that's where I learned. That's where I had a very deep teaching and schooling, and it didn't have anything to do with an institution. It had to do with the community that was there, because it was a very international community. I was really taught to respect other cultures and to value them and to pay attention and to notice how they think, not only how they dress and what kinds of foods they eat, but how they're thinking too. And so I'm really grateful for that.
It's so interesting, because for me, you're fitting absolutely the perfect, sort of description of the people who I see are able to carry this indigenous wisdom into the modern world. There is an amazing sort of paradox here, I think, where people who have tasted the industrial modern life and had a taste of the more land-based, earth-based, more indigenous ways, start seeing a pattern, and then having had international experience and seeing different cultures, again, it seems to be, it's really almost all the people that I deeply respect have that experience. And I'd love for us to talk more about that later, because I think what I'm seeing is that the most indigenous, as it were, people now, for instance, my beloved Ladakhis, the most remote nomads on the Tibetan plateau, who are still so deeply embedded, are so vulnerable to the message that they're stupid and backward and they must send their children to school. And it's people who've had a bit of experience of that, what that schooling is taking you into the big urban city and what that means, that are becoming the strong voices for saying, no, let's work together to find a way forward. I don't know what you would say about that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think, I mean, really it's being a translator. It's being a translator between two very different worlds. And it's in these two languages that each paradigm uses and holds are so radically different. Methodologies for who speaks, when, how, all these different things that they really can't speak to each other unless you have this translator. And even then, as with any language, you can get close, but that's one thing I think we really have to recognize in these encounters, and even for the work that I do, is that I can't really bring it all forward. I can't. And I always wish that, in an interview like this, that we had the possibility of talking to, what I would say, the really true elders, the elders that are sitting at home on the land and who stay there. And yet they might not be interested in having this conversation either. They have their own reasons. There's a reason why they're staying there. So, I really, of course, I bow down and respect those people who hold that space. And I have huge respect for the people who, for Indigenous peoples worldwide, who, are pointing out the injustices, the difficulties, and expressing their anger over history. I respect those people as well. And I'm glad that they're holding that space, because I don't know what the world would be if they weren't voicing those things. And at the same time, I also feel like the place I hold of not necessarily being the one to voice those things, but to keep looking for ways to translate to each other, which could be peacemaking, but mostly it's just trying to propose that there's very different ways for a human being to be in the exact same place. And in modern world paradigm, I feel like people, I was raised in that paradigm mostly, and was heading for, high academics and ideally fame and fortune, right? That's the plan.
Exactly.
But it was hurting my soul so deeply that I was looking for a way out. And that's the thing about that modern world paradigm side of things, is no one is really, it's never proposed that it could be any other way. Like, this is it, this is reality. And there's no indication at all, wait, no, this is a choice that some human beings are making about who we are, where we are, and how it is. So anyway, I'll just say that, yeah, I noticed that it's people like me who can be in this translation seat, and there are limitations to it. But I think it absolutely is necessary.
Absolutely, but of course it's also being ambassadors between two worlds, and that doesn't mean that we have, the deep experiential knowledge of, of any individual. I mean, even from individual to individual, where, we can never speak for another person, but I think there's a pattern that emerges that is of vital and central importance. And actually, more in terms of your childhood, then when was it that you were hurting and you really were looking for something else? How old were you by that time?
Well, I mean, I was experiencing quite a bit of pain and confusion for a while, because I look like I'm full-blooded Indigenous, which I am. And yet, the history of my family was that, my grandparents were taken into residential missionary boarding schools, where they weren't with their family. They were raised by missionaries in an institution, and that's where they met. And then they sent their children, and that's where my parents met also. And so by the time I came along, people in my immediate family were not practicing our culture, our spiritual ways, or speaking our language. So I have to say that there was a great deal of confusion for me in general, just looking the way I looked, and yet not having the goods, not having the knowledge, not having, people would always ask me, they'd come up and see me, and of course they'd say, well, gosh, how do your people say this, or what do they do about that? And, and I had nothing to say to them. And so, that was going on that way. But I'd say where the really big fork in the road came, one, I got sent to an East Coast boarding school here in the United States, called Phillips Exeter Academy, which is sort of the epitome of the young person age 14 to 18 to be indoctrinated into, you know, preparation for going to Ivy League colleges and et cetera. I was going to school at Diplomats Children's, presidential candidates used to come and speak at our school, and et cetera. So, but there was, so on the one hand, there was a sense of, my parents were elated and felt like I was, you know, in the cream of the crop of the United States. And yet for myself, I just felt a lot of emptiness and devastation for just not understanding how all this was going to come out okay. And then when I was 29 years old, I definitely hit this place where, you know, I'd been trying to run in every imaginable way from myself and from this life. I just didn't understand what I was supposed to do here. It didn't make any sense to me. And at this point I had 2 children. And I will say that, you know, I had watched people, you know, wrestling with this, you know, cultural interruption piece in my family for generations, you know, and I had watched people try to destroy themselves, you know, from that pain. And I could feel myself headed that way. And I knew the pain of what it was to be a young child watching the adults around me not be able to cope and not be able, this wasn't all the adults, but many.
Yeah.
And so using addiction and other things to try to make it through life, and all the craziness and insanity that goes along with that. And I realized, wow, I am getting ready to do the exact same thing and putting these 2 little kids that I have through that same mess, you know. And so I sent a cry out to the world. And at that point I had left the church, you know, I'd been raised in the church myself. And when I went to boarding school, I stopped going, which was really frightening to stop going. I didn't know what was going to happen to my soul or me or anything, but I just felt like, no, I cannot keep going to this. And anyway, so at 29 years old, when I sent this cry out, I really had no idea what would come back and answer me. And what came back to answer me was people invited me to my first Native American ceremony ever. They invited me to a sweat lodge, a Lakota sweat lodge, and the rest, as they say, is history. That's been my spiritual path ever since, a little over 25 years now. Yeah.
And what would you say, you know, my take on it is that the Western, urban, competitive, hyper-individualistic, you know, the whole package creates that pain in virtually everyone, which is why, you know, most teenagers also go through this deep suffering and feeling, you know, the meaninglessness of life, you know, because of the alienation. And we see all forms of addiction within that culture as well. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's the preparation ground to be able to, quote unquote, succeed in what I call the power over paradigm.
Yeah.
And the power over paradigm, might makes right, and it's an inherently violent paradigm. And basically what it says is, in order to have what you need, you have to beat somebody else out for what they need. And the goal is to do your very best not to be at the very bottom of the pyramid, but to have moved up somewhere above that, because the people at the bottom were expendable and are expendable, which we're seeing at this very time and on the earth right now with this pandemic, what that attitude is like, and how people would make decisions because they've been so convinced that this is the only paradigm, and they've been trained to succeed in it, which means a very brutal way of being with each other. And I know as a young person, for me, I was looking for something else. Now I know it was community, and it was multi-generational community.
Exactly.
So yeah,
that
I
was
would
the
say,
biggest lesson for me from Ladakh, is exactly multi-generational community, and just seeing, you know, when you segregate 1-year-olds into 30 of them in one room with one adult, you've created a universe of elbows. They literally can't support each other. And yeah, how I wish the world would wake up to that simple truth. And, you know, for me, I want to talk more about that later. This whole issue is about localization as a systemic economic transition towards that more cooperative, intergenerational, community-based economy, and where the community is, as you also talk so beautifully about, about life and thriving life, that the community is also the non-human living world around us. I've heard you say that you would describe Indigenous as being people of place. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. So yeah, to me, I mean, I guess literally that's what the word means, to be a place, to be indigenous. And I know that there are many people that I would maybe call indigenous that balk at that word. But I think it's a good word for our time, because I really feel like just as a species, as a whole, so many of us, too many of us, just have not really accepted or considered deeply, much less really gone into the science of it, of understanding that we're indigenous to Earth. We surround ourselves with giant structures. I mean, I'm thinking like New York City or some of the larger cities, and I'm like, we surround ourselves completely with things that came out of the human mind, and we begin to believe that that is the structure that we live in. In fact, I'm sure there are children who have grown up in these urban places and have never left, and who have had their own children, and I mean, that's it, right? And so we don't really understand what it means to be indigenous to Earth. So there's that wider perspective, but when I look at myself and my people culturally, I say, okay, so we are of a certain place, and to be of that place means to, and so this is over millennia. So this is generation after generation after generation after generation. And especially when you have a ceremonial life, when you have a broad spectrum of ways of knowing, you have an ability to make relationship with place such that it becomes a conversation is possible with the place over seasons, over, longer weather patterns, over, unusual events, and how the people dealt with that, and how the land helped them to overcome difficulties. And so all that builds, just like with any relationship, when you've really weathered some storms with a person, there's a love there, and there's a way of being able to just look at each other and know at a glance what the other one is thinking and what is needed. And that also becomes true with place. And so I guess that's what I'm saying about indigenous means being of place. And some of us have been in place longer than others, or more recently, maybe we could say.
More recently, yes, because ultimately we were all indigenous. And you talked so beautifully also about how you had this life-changing experience when you heard the description of the people who were describing the indigenous people. Can you tell us more about that? I loved your description of that.
Yeah, for me, this is often a beginning place of being able to be a translator, because oftentimes the way that I talk and terms that I use and activities that I talk about that are a part of my daily life aren't readily received in modern world paradigm, in very intellectual paradigm, in very reductionist thought process paradigm. It's very hard for those who have not built a broad spectrum of ways of knowing to be able to receive what I have to say. So often I start right here and saying, and this actually comes from the wonderful Dr. Greg Cajete. He wrote a book called Native Science. And in that book, he was the one who was talking about, about what, when he was reading with the first anthropologists, I call them the ologists, when the ologists were first meeting us and writing about us, he was the one who noticed that every time he read them, he would see that they would say that when they would refer to us, that we were primitive and childlike. We were primitive and childlike people. And I just love him because he didn't go right away to, what a bunch of racists such and such is. Instead, he said, there's a system of thought going on over there that is such that every time these people see us, these are the words that come to mind. And I wonder what that system of thought is. I think that's a very useful way of approaching many, many things in our world right now. That's really a wise way, right?
Yeah.
So he said, all right, well, let me examine, you know, if I knew more about who these guys were that are writing about us and what their culture was like, I could understand why they're saying this. And so he, you know, looking over the fence through his lenses, because we all have our lenses, what he thought he saw was that most of the early writers who wrote about indigenous people in what we now call the United States were English aristocratic men. And so he said, all right, well, let me see if I can understand what their culture is like. And what he believed he saw was that these guys, up until the age of 5 in their culture, they were allowed to sing, dance, play, pretend, etc. But at the age of 5, it was time to get down to the serious business of being the educated man. And so at that point, you know, all these other activities could be hobbies, but the primary activity became the honing of the intellect, the training of the intellect. And so everything was focused on that. And that's how it pretty much remained for them until their death, right? So here come these guys over to see us in what we now call the United States. And what were we doing, these indigenous peoples there? We were singing, we were dancing, we were having conversations with things that they didn't think you could talk to. We were receiving visions. And even our grown men were involved in these activities, right? And so their only conclusion was, these are primitive and childlike people. And so when I read that, everything changed for me because, well, one, it just explained so much of the entire world to me, certainly as an indigenous person, but maybe for anybody. But for me, what it also came to me was, okay, so for my people, we don't have that rule that at the age of 5, you stop all those activities. So when you think about it, children all over the world, they all do that. Every human being, every one of our species starts out with that seeing, that really deep way of seeing and hearing. We say when we look at children playing that they're pretending to have conversations. I'm not so sure. I think they are having conversations with things around them, animals and plants and insects and etc. So anyway, we all start out that way. But for us, I realized we don't have that thing at the age of 5 where we put that away. We keep all of that open, all the way from birth until death. And in fact, we begin to cultivate ways to do these activities together in community, such that we begin to have shared knowledge. And we not only have shared knowledge, but we generate knowledge collectively, which is not something that modern world knows much about. Everybody's trying to have the best idea first and get full credit by themselves for it. But this is a very different way of coming to knowledge.
Yeah.
And so I realized, wow, so another way of saying that is to say that we maintain a broad spectrum of ways of knowing. We don't limit ourselves only to intellect. And I think that this is also the reason why we have been able to have practices that are long-term sustainability practices, like for millennia, in place. Yeah. And that has to do with, you can't really have that relationship with place such that you can have sustainability unless you have a broad spectrum of ways of knowing. It cannot be done with intellect alone. And that's a hard case to make in modern world, but I'm working on it.
Well, I'm right with you, totally with you. And I talk about it also as the difference between that left brain intellectual knowledge and embodied experiential knowledge. When the entire body, the sense of smell, all our senses are involved in appreciating the complexity of the living world. But this is also why I'm so adamant about the need to shorten the distance between the bit of the living world, its people and non-human life, and using it for our needs. So the economic transactional economy, unless we are closer to the people we're having an impact on and the rest of nature we're having an impact on, we cannot appreciate the full complexity and the fact that nothing remains the same, nothing remains static, everything in flux and change. So that feedback that came to Indigenous people made them responsive, made them humble, in the face of complexity. And as you said, all the time sharing it as a group, in a participatory way. And they built, as you said, over millennia, collective knowledge. That plant we can use when it's been dried and we can feed it to animals, but humans can't eat it, it's poisonous. This one you can only eat in the spring, or this can be used in this way. So that deep, intimate knowledge is what, for me, localization is all about.
Right, and I think another thing to maybe bring into that conversation about local is that, so for many Indigenous peoples, they have something that they might have some words for called original instructions, right? So this is kind of like the understanding the lay of the land, understanding the construct that humanity was placed in here on this earth. And so this is something that I've been exploring a lot recently, and that has to do with this idea of consent and also this idea of sovereignty. So I'm going to say that the way from my outlook and my experience, I have decided that I believe that we live in a construct, a free will construct. And so what that means is that we can pretty much do whatever we come up with, right? I mean, I think that seems clear that we can do that. That's what's been going on the planet everywhere. Everybody's been doing whatever they can dream up to do, that's what they do. And that's really fueled by what we just were talking about how the best idea and you getting the best idea all by yourself and trying it out first is the way. And so we don't have much, there's no intergenerational council, there's no intercultural council, there's no global council. People just come up with an idea and they can see one use for it and they go for it, right? And so that's doable, that's possible. However, there's a caveat to that apparently, and the caveat to that is this, and that is that you might be able to do anything you can dream up, but you might not be able to have life on this Mother Earth if you do everything you can dream up. So it begs for this idea that, all right, well, maybe you can't just do anything. Well, what's the criteria for what you might not be able to do? And I think Indigenous cultures have been very meticulous about passing down their understanding of what makes sense to do here and what doesn't. And so one of those things is this idea of every being has sovereignty. Not just humans, but every single being is a sovereign being, and they have a role to play. And here I might bring up this concept of the sacred hoop. So there's this sacred hoop of life, like a circle. And every life form gets to have a seat on this sacred hoop. And every life form has to uphold their part of the sacred hoop. And if any life form doesn't uphold their part, then the integrity of the hoop begins to fail, and their neighbors begin to not be able to uphold their part quite as well. And so things begin to deteriorate. And so this is where this idea of sovereignty comes in as well, is that each being has a very particular thing that they offer to this hoop. And so no other member of the hoop, I mean, it doesn't make sense for them to, but I will also go so far as to say, I don't believe we have the right to interfere with any one of the beings' perfect design for thriving life and their ability to uphold their part of the hoop. We must not interfere with that. So that's what I mean when I say each being has sovereignty. They have to be allowed to fulfill their trajectory and their role. And so when we don't understand that every being has sovereignty, we interfere with all of these different roles. We interfere with all these different beings being able to uphold their part. I mean, we truly are an interbeing.
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking that, if we could, I mean, what would it take for us to really acknowledge that every being has sovereignty? My elders, every time when we would go out to collect sage medicine for ceremony, my clan grandfather would say, you need to have a conversation with these beings. You need to ask if it's okay for you to take them. Maybe there's something going on with them right now that that they'd say, now's not a good time. Why don't you try those guys way over there? Or, and so people say, well, how do you know if they're saying yes or no? Well, that takes time and practice. If you keep going out and you keep going out, it'll begin to register in your own body. You will begin to have this conversation. But so that's why we make offerings before we take anything, and we have this conversation. And that is a part of creating a consensual relationship that is honoring of the sovereignty of all the beings involved. So that's one thing that I'm seeing with this localization versus globalization is, just like you're saying, you cannot begin to see who is impacted from across the world when you get on Amazon and you order whatever you're ordering from somewhere over there, not to mention the Amazon workers who apparently aren't having it so good right now in their situation with this pandemic going on, and the financial structure that they're in. So there's no way to really honor that sovereignty when you are reaching so far beyond your own locale. You can't begin to know how things are harvested. So, we talk about fair trade coffees and chocolates, and that's some way of trying to tell you, look, we tried to do this in a good way, in a relational way, where nobody is being exploited, but we can't really know. And so it's very hard for us to remain within that law of consent and the law of honoring the sovereignty of all beings when we're outside of the local.
So the hubris and the arrogance of this narrowly focused science that is part of a giant machine of large-scale economic structures, long-distance relationships, creates a system that couldn't be more arrogant, and in many ways couldn't be more evil. It's about cutting apart the fabric of life, as I see it, in this blind way. But because it's blind, I don't think of the individuals as evil. I think of the system, and the acts are a type of evil, but it's mainly ignorance. Wouldn't you agree?
I would, and I was going to say, I actually have probably some would say a compassion to a fault for modern world paradigmers. Like I say, having been raised in that paradigm primarily, I understand what people are up against to really think outside of that space. Only in the last, I'd say, couple of months have I really realized that I sit in a very big place of privilege here right now as an Indigenous person, because I have a window into a very real life scenario of people who think about things in a very different way. I can refer to this amazing being, my clan grandfather, and talk about what he talked about.
Yeah.
He's no longer here on earth right now, but and so again, it's a really daunting prospect to be in a paradigm where you really believe like this is the only way. You have to get on top of that heap, or you will not be able to provide for children or family or whatever. And unfortunately, the mindset of it means that even after you've made your first $1 billion, you still have that sense. I mean, it's a crazy making way of being that is self-perpetuating to such outlandish degrees. But I really get that if you believe that is the sole reality here, and why wouldn't you think that? You were born into it, your parents were born into it, your grandparents were born into it. So it's multi-generational, it's reinforced. To make matters worse, it might have appeared to be working for your great-grandfather at one time. And I really feel for the men of today in modern world paradigm, because they're like, wow, my great-grandfather did this for their family, and my grandfather was able to do this, and my father was even able to do this, and why can't I make this work? And it's because, it's literally a pyramid scheme. And so it only worked for so long to benefit some people, but eventually someone gets left holding the bag. So, I have a huge amount of compassion for people who really believe that that's the only way. And I just happen to know that there are other ways of being here that don't necessarily lead to that.
And that don't lead to either that loneliness, that frustration, that sense of deep, I think, alienation. To come back to those English aristocrats, I've actually known that culture quite intimately, some of it even in my family. And the thing that we also need to recognize is that this way of being trained into left brain intellectualism was a way of suppressing your own needs, your own heart, your own body. It was a perfect way of raising young men to go out to conquer the world without any feeling, because they were trained not even to have feeling for themselves. And it's what we see is that, those children up to about 5 were allowed not only to sing and dance, but they were allowed to have emotion, they were allowed to cry, they were allowed to feel. As when you're trained into that system, that's the systematic suppression of feelings in your own body, of being in touch with your own body, with your own needs, with your own heart. So it's a terrible prison. And it is wonderful that we now have more and more recognition of that. There's this whole micro trend towards more truly embodied therapy, where we're actually being helped to come back into our senses and into our feelings. And of course, we have many examples now of reconnection as the healing paradigm. For me, that's also fundamentally what localization is about, is that reconnection, deep reconnection to others and to life itself. And that experience of oneness is, for me, what lies behind virtually every spiritual tradition and religion. And the deep joy and ecstasy from being able to feel part of that enormous family of life. And I'm sure you've seen that also in, emerging now in the white patriarchal colonial culture.
Yeah, I often have the opportunity to work with young people, and that's a really big thing for them. I work a lot with college students, and sometimes they even let me work with high school students. I feel like I'm a little radical sometimes, maybe, for them. But what I end up saying to them is, you've got to want your life. You've got to want your life. You've got to want it. And so whatever it is that makes you want your life, do it. Do that. Do that. And I also tell them, your joy matters. Your joy matters. And every time I say that, there's always just like stunned silence. And I always have to say it like at least one more time, if not 2 more times. And I have to just say it so that these young people can even let it in. Because they're on this track, right? They're on this track that, just like you're saying, that tells them, joy is, we don't even bring up joy to our children.
No.
And I've been telling them, I said, nobody ever said that to me. Nobody ever said that my joy mattered. Yeah. And I usually check with all the adults in the room and say, did anybody ever say that to you? No. And we don't talk about joy. And I think the reason we don't talk about joy, not even with our beloved young people. That's kind of that's a crazy marker as a human being, that you would not say that to a young person. Your joy matters. And the reason we don't say that is because we know that you're going to enter into this system where you're probably not going to get to think much about joy, or reach for joy, or experience much joy. So, it's kind of better that we just don't even bring it up.
I feel so blessed, because having been involved, for 40 years now in promoting this sort of community-based localizing path, I'm getting so much news from the grassroots around the world, where community building, particularly around local food and so on, is happening. And so I'm getting every day, news from the grassroots that you just don't get in the media. And that's where I see this amazing testimony to the perseverance of human beings to reconnect again, to listen to their whole bodies, and to clear path where from the bottom up, people are clearly showing valuing of the indigenous peoples, of life, of animals, there's been a cultural transformation going on. From my point of view, what hasn't been transformed is the economic trajectory, which now at the top of the pyramid scheme, our national government leaders and our global business leaders on the whole are just looking at their numbers and at growth and fearfully running in the same direction and, you know, virtually losing their humanity. But and so they come out with these pronouncements, you know, we've got to keep the economy alive over everything else, you know, life itself, human beings, a few old people, don't matter, it's the economy. But my absolute conviction is that that's not the voice of the majority. And I do see all kinds of signs of people in their local areas supporting each other now and developing mechanisms and tools, especially all around the world. Every seed, every seedling, you know, has disappeared, you know, even from farmers markets as people are starting to grow food and they're often, you know, yeah, really getting in touch with the earth again, touching the soil, growing food and connecting with each other. And yeah.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with a dear friend from Jerusalem this morning, and he was reminding me of something that one of my favorite authors is Joseph Chilton Pearce.
Yes.
And he wrote The Biology of Transcendence, which you got plenty of time now. It takes a little time for me to get through that book. It's quite dense, but it's really amazing. But one of the things that I always remember from that book is he was talking about the fall of Poland. And I have to say, I'm not a huge Polish history buff or anything, but I get the idea from what he's saying that Poland has fallen many times, but in one of these times that it fell, there was a group of farmers who were really in deep cooperation and collaboration all throughout the country. They had a cooperative, right? And so when everything else fell, because they had a community, they had cohesion, everything else began to be rebuilt around them. And so he said, you know, so maybe the goal isn't so much to try to steer the entire global ship in a particular direction all at once, but what we can be doing is we can be building lifeboats of cohesion, he said. And so that's what I feel like I'm witnessing on a local level, and also by internet, local cohesive lifeboats connecting with other ones. But nevertheless, you know, so reaching out and seeing what other people are doing, and then going back locally and figuring out how to make that stronger and stronger and stronger. And that's very hopeful for me, because it doesn't even have to be on, quote, on topic of well, how are we going to deal with restructuring economy? It really has to do, again, with what gives you joy and pleasure to be in each other's company. And how do we keep deepening that and trusting that? So that's been one of the great pleasures of this time for me, is an all new appreciation, even for my global communities where we come together on Zoom and just check in. We've been checking in a couple times a week now, a couple different groups, and it's just so beautiful. So yeah, I find that very, very hopeful and helpful at this time, you know, that we can each be building some kind of lifeboat of cohesion and coherence.
Absolutely. And, you know, sharing now, while we're still using this technology so much, sharing across the Zoom and the internet to share experience and knowledge and develop a sense of a bigger community as these circles of cohesion or community building, feel part of a much bigger family. It gives incredible strength and inspiration, and the hope that these lifeboats can multiply much more rapidly than one would have thought. I think right now there is a feeling that could happen.
People have been saying, you know, that humans are the virus, and that the corona is the medicine for us. And then there's usually this comment that says, you know, we're expendable. We don't really have to be here. We're just nothing but trouble. And this is something that I feel really grateful to have from my culture, is a very, and it's in my gut too. I always say, you know, we have low self-esteem as a species right now, but I really feel like the plan has never been for us to just get lost because we don't know what to do, we don't know how to be here. our Mother Earth, we're here for a purpose. We're here for a reason. We've been given a seat on this sacred hoop of life. And there is a way in which all life will thrive greater and greater by our being here. And I think that's the big question for me is, okay, well, what is that way? What is that way for us to be here such that that happens, such that we really fulfill the destiny of the five-fingered presence on that sacred hoop?
Well, for me, as far as I'm concerned, the indigenous people showed us the pattern of what it is. And the pattern is adaptation to life, which means diversity. And so we're never going to go back to exactly the same way, because we need to, and we will learn from each other. But so it's not going to be exactly the same, but the basic pattern is that multi-generational community, which includes the community of living plants, of life around us, of thriving life, as you say. What does that look like? It means that deeper communion. We can't be basing our lives on using things that we have no idea about their origin, no idea about what those people suffered or what happened to those plants in these giant monocultures. And really, for me, also, I think that pessimism about the human race comes out of a culture that has come to dominate the entire planet. So it's actually a condemnation of a culture, and it's a condemnation of a globalizing culture that thought that it could conquer the world and control and dictate, that all life on earth should follow this particular culture. So it's not a condemnation of human nature. It's a combination of a particular culture. And I think that's really, really important distinction. But I see most Westerners continually generalizing what's happening as a consequence of I say human culture, but it's really a human culture and a human economic system that has come out of over-narrow science and far too large scale, far too much speed, reductionist, as you say. That is not working. And smaller scale, slower pace, more human scale, back to the local seems to be the pattern we should be working for.
Yeah, we're in a place that insists upon relationship. So I always tell people, try having a romance with your intellect only and see how far you get. And so we have not been having the depth of relationship that we can have with place through intellect. We can't. We actually can't do it. And we actually know that from our own experience. But also, like you're saying, one way that I look at that is to say that this actually came up in trying to explore what does it mean to be, what does it mean when we say masculine? What does it mean when we say feminine? And I was in ceremony one time, and what I got back from that question was, you think you know what it is when you say masculine, and you think you know what you're saying when you say feminine, but you don't. All you know is those two energies behave when you plug them into a power over paradigm. Exactly. But they would behave in a completely different way if you plug them into a different paradigm. And so I'm going to say it's the same when we ask about our humanity. You think you know what it is to be human, but you don't. Yeah. All you know is how a human behaves in a power over paradigm. But what if you were to plug that human being into a completely different paradigm?
Yeah. And to me, another way to describe it is what happens to people when you imprison them, totally disconnected from life and disconnected from their own emotions and so on. What happens when you're in a prison that doesn't allow you to be human? Can you say more about your view on the sacred masculine, or the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine?
Well, those are very big topics, but I guess what comes to mind immediately is one, what I was just saying is why I say, I don't equate the patriarchy with men. Men and patriarchy are not the same thing. Patriarchy is talking about how masculine behaves in a certain paradigm, but it's not only masculine. I've met some unbelievably patriarchal women in my time. I'm sure we all have. And so that has to do with the system. And so I think it's a really big question right now. I think we've begun to explore a bit about what sacred feminine is. certainly with the arising of goddess culture and etc. That's not a very comfortable place for me to be, honestly, but I appreciate that those questions and that exploration is happening. But I feel like from my own being brought back into Indigenous culture, first just getting over this fear of having this idea that each of our biological aspects holds a spiritual capacity. So as the female of our kind, I hold a certain spiritual capacity, and it's very connected to my biology, and mostly there I'm referring to menstruation and moon time. And that gives me a connection to earth in such a way that I should have a very big voice in community, and I should even have a role in leadership, because I have a natural ability to connect and receive instruction for how to be here for Mother Earth. So when we say that in modern world paradigm, right away, as soon as you single anybody out to talk about them, that's why you can't say Black Lives Matter, because what comes back immediately is, well, all lives matter. Then that has to do with this power over paradigm. As soon as we single somebody out and I say, the women are synonymous with life, the women are synonymous with earth. That's what almost any indigenous culture anywhere in the world you go to, that's what the understanding is. And it's not something that needs to be argued. There's no, well, what about the men? And what about, it's not a competition. Those things aren't put in competition with each other. That arises directly out of the paradigm, because at all times you have to know who has the power. And anytime anything changes, you have to ask yourself, wait a minute, did that just give me more power, or did that take power from me? Because you're in this constant scramble. And so it's very hard for us to appreciate what the feminine holds on its own. And it's very hard for us to appreciate what the masculine holds. So, one of my great passions right now is to explore what is the sacred masculine? What is like the thriving life functioning of the masculine? What is that role? And one thing that that you brought up about the men, cutting them off from their feelings in these, especially in those scholastic places and academic places. But I also discovered when I was doing a lot of work around the witch hunts, what took place during the witch hunts in Europe, was, that subduing of the way of the circle, that subduing of the way where the woman's voice was held and in a place of leadership and a place of honor and respect, as those ways were being destroyed in Europe. I mean, and it took hundreds of years. I mean, Europe fought this, just like indigenous people right now are fighting it all over the world. They knew those ancestors in Europe that this was a big deal for that to be destroyed. They fought it for hundreds of years. But in that process of those hundreds of years, that those methodologies for subduing the way of the circle were perfected. And that's why those men who were the grandchildren and the sons and the grandsons of the men who did this destruction, or who were unable to stop the destruction of the women, they were the ones who got sent on the boats. And that's also why they had this vacancy. They couldn't feel what they were doing, because there's a great wound that happens when the men are not able to be the sacred defenders of life. That is part of their I'm going to call it their archetypal spiritual signature. So right now I'm really looking at what would the language of the sacred masculine be, because I don't think we have it. And I don't know if Eve Ensler was the first one to say this, but I heard her say it. She said, when we don't have a narrative for something, it remains largely invisible to us. And so if we don't have a narrative for sacred masculine, it's going to remain invisible to us. Right now, because of the power over paradigm, and because might makes right, and therefore that's why men dominate in such a paradigm, we equate men with that paradigm. But in order for us to come into our full functioning, and I'm going to say, in order for us to come into our full capacity for sustainability, I think it's necessary for us to back off of that idea that men are that paradigm. They're not. and for us to explore collectively. And there are many things arising all over the world, which is really beautiful to me, in which we're asking, what is that sacred role of the masculine, if not dominance and power over, right?
Well, I think you said briefly, I think you referred to it as also partly being, you know, the defenders of the circle, or, you know, again, when I think of my experience in Ladakh, it was so clear that men already by the age of 5 were looking after infants, were nurturing young animals, you know, so their nurturing feminine side was not squashed. And they were able to sing and dance and weep and, you know, maintain characteristics that are seen as archetypically feminine. And I remember almost weeping when I first saw, you know, this 13-year-old boy cooing over a baby just the way a granny would. And I realized I had never ever seen that in my Western culture upbringing, never ever seen that in that way. And then, you know, the women were so strong and empowered and had a very important role in the community and in agriculture, which was the main economy, and animal husbandry. But then in came literally Rambo and Barbie doll as the role models. And it was just this amazing machine, just polarizing so dramatically, making a caricature of both. But so I guess I would say that the sacred feminine and the sacred masculine are not that far apart.
It really makes me think about something my daughter's been saying for a while, which is that in some ways, I think we could say that the men of our species are way more emotional than women. They have not been given any space to be that. But when I look at Indigenous men in intact, or at least somewhat intact culture, their emotional range is giant. I mean, giant. Because on the one hand, you know, in the prayers, they're weeping over their grandchildren and they're praying for their little backpacks and school pencils because they're going to go off to school. I mean, it's just the tenderest thing you've ever seen. And then in the next part of ceremony, and you know, in the days following that, then they're asked to go out and take the life of an animal. And they have to do that in a ceremonial way. And then even beyond that, there's that ultimate sacrifice of laying down your life for the protection of the women, elders, and children. So when I think about that spectrum of emotion that's being asked of the intact man, it's huge. It's huge.
Yeah.
But going back to this question of the eros, you know, so I say, well, one thing that's, you know, I always hate to have this pun come out, but I don't know how else to say it, that's very prominent about the male of our species is this eros. And so I have to say, you know, somehow we have got that all twisted up. I mean, on both sides, women and men and everybody in between. In that we've really demonized that eros at this point, certainly now on the planet with Me Too, and, et cetera. And it definitely has gone off in some kind of wild direction. But I have to believe that because that is such a prominent feature biologically for men, that there is something so sacred about that, something so holy about that, something so enriching to our lives that we somehow have gotten all twisted up. Now, I don't have the full answer of like, how do we undo whatever that is? But I have to start out by saying to the men, you know, I apologize for not being able to honor that part of you. And it's been very frightening to me. But I know now that it's precious and it's sacred. And so one of the ways that I talk about it as a beginning place is to say, so this is the sacred fire that drives the engine of life forward. I mean, this is assuring that life is going to go on, and the men are holding that fire. They're holding that engine inside of themselves. And so that's to be valued. When we try to translate our way of being that has been developed over, you know, who knows how long. And when we try to translate that, especially through academia, that's one of the big meeting places, right?
Yeah.
And so kind of what happened, I feel like, is, well, first we had to prove that we were human as Indigenous people. Then we had to prove that we had intelligence. And the only way to do that was, I mean, how do you prove you're intelligent to somebody? Well, you have to do it by their standard, right? Otherwise they don't get it, they don't believe it. And so part of that is how so many Indigenous people end up in the academic systems. And then we didn't like that all these ologists of European descent were writing about us and interpreting us and what we do and why we do it and how we do it. And you know, because they were looking through their lens that was from a completely different paradigm, they were incorrect, right? And they were giving misinformation. And so we hop in and say, well, we'll write about ourselves. Thank you very much, you know. And so I got this warning when I was at an Indigenous peoples gathering in India in the night. Like, it was very dramatic. I got woken up and they said, now listen here, and you got to say this tomorrow to this group, you know. And but they were saying to me, you know, why are you as Indigenous people describing yourselves to other Indigenous people through a PhD thesis, through an academic lens, through the very lens of the ones who really felt compelled to dismantle what you held, and to then shepherd you into their way of thinking? Like, why is this happening? That you got to really think about what's happening here. And you know, you have to be very careful about not only conceptualizing who you are and what you do and how you do it and why you do it and what happens when you do it, to Western paradigm, but you're in danger of conceptualizing it to yourself. So as an Indigenous person, if what these ceremonies become a concept, they will lose their potency, they will lose their ability, they will lose the power that they hold. And the worst part will be is as the generations go by, nobody's even going to know the difference.
The very nature of academic knowledge and of scientific knowledge is dismembering. You know, it is this deconstruction. So we're dismembering not just Indigenous culture, but we're dismembering life itself. And, you know, to get to genetic engineering, we had to study it under warlike conditions, using technology that bombarded to smithereens, behaving in completely unnatural ways. So the complexity of the dance of life and the cells, and, you know, so I don't know if you would want to say anything more about modern science and the direction it's going, and would you have you been advising academics and, you know, having discussions about what your words of wisdom are for the scientific community?
Occasionally, I guess. I used to be a part of this amazing group, and it was called The Language of Spirit, and it started out in Canada, but eventually moved to New Mexico, here in the Southwest United States. And it was a gathering of quantum physicists, linguists, Western educated Indigenous people, and traditional knowledge keepers. And we would do a dialogue for 4 days. And it was billed as, you know, the first time that Indigenous science was put on the same footing as the top tier of Western science. So we had Nobel Prize laureates in physics there. We had NASA there. So it was pretty amazing. And I got to hold one of the 24 seats for 4 years. So I learned a lot in that process. And then more recently, you know, I went to this gathering called the New Story Summit, and that was at Findhorn.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think the idea was that, you know, we're always operating out of a story. We're story-based beings. And right now, the story that we're operating out of is terrible. It's leading someplace we don't want it to go. It's leading to death. And so what would the elements be of a new story? So, you know, it's 52 countries represented, about 350 people, lots of Indigenous peoples represented. But anyway, what came for me out of that was my spirit helpers came to me in the middle of that, and they said, rather than try to tell a new story from this point forward, you would be better off retelling the old story. And if you go back and you retell the old story, you'll automatically change the trajectory into the future.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I sat with that and I thought, wow, that really rings true in my bones, but I have no idea what I would do with that information. But okay, I'm listening. And so then I was given, I'll say, an opportunity. It kind of came in a pretty difficult way, but nevertheless, it turned out okay, fortunately. But of how to use that information. And that was when I was asked to address or to take a look at what took place during the witch hunts in Europe, and then
Yeah.
to be able to address it ceremonially.
Mm.
Well, and as soon as we finished with that, we did that in 2016. And then in 2017, or 2018, you know, my spirit guides came back to me and they said, great, you did fantastic at that. I mean, I barely lived through that experience. So it was really, really deep. It was very difficult. But they said, okay, you did great at that. So now we want to point out to you, they called it an archetypal wounding of humanity.
Yeah.
And so now
Who is the they? Who are the they?
These are my spirit helpers.
Oh, the spirit helpers were saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they said, okay, great. So now we want to point out to you another archetypal wounding of humanity, and that has to do with your relationship with science. So that's a pretty broad term these days, science. But, you know, so right away I could say, you know, if I were to just say what I thought the problem with science was, I could rattle it off the top of my head. One of the primary things being, you know, a total disregard for the sovereignty of all beings. And this delusion that we can be objective, and even if people are trying to be objective, right now they're being heavily influenced by economic gain and power and prestige if they come out with the right results, and you know, so they're not even following their own rules that way. But I guess my biggest pet peeve is the way that, you know, Western science has treated indigenous knowledge for so long. Only very recently have they been like, maybe we went a little too fast there and ran over some things that we shouldn't have.
Yeah.
So actually I'm in the process of beginning to convene some dialogues, because what I learned in addressing the first archetypal wounding of humanity that was brought to my attention, which they said was what took place during the witch hunts in Europe, was, you know, I thought I knew what the problem was there. And if I had just gone with what I knew, I would have called the ceremonies we ended up doing, you know, let's try to heal what all those damn men did. And I would have missed like layers and layers and layers of what the real wounding was about, because the sacred masculine was as deeply wounded as the sacred feminine, and so many other things, so many other connections. And so I have to believe that that's true about what they're saying about science. And so I'm in the process of convening some dialogue circles similar to the ones I did previously, you know, at these gatherings in New Mexico, to inquire from folks about what do you see as the harm that Western science has created for us.
Great. I'd love to be part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, great. We did the first one in California last year around Bioneers time, in October, and we had planned to do one in the UK. It's kind of looking a little iffy at the moment, but anyway, the idea was to do one in the UK, one in India, and one in Japan, and then come back and do another one in the United States. I felt compelled to convene these conversations in India and Japan or China, was because those countries have such a long, strong indigenous culture, and at the same time, so many, you know, members of their people are called into the sciences in a very Western education way. And so I feel like it would be really powerful to actually have these conversations in the land where they're holding these seemingly opposing ways of being. So that's
for me, what's so scary is that the other ways of being, you know, they are disappearing, and of course they disappear with the languages that are dying, and you know, you see acupuncture now even in China being pulled into this. And I see it more, you know, in the beginning I used to think of it as Western, but now I see it much more as coming out of this economic system. And I keep thinking we shouldn't really call it culture. It's like a machine-like system now, which to a great extent is even dominated by the algorithms in the finance market, you know, and this creation of these quadrillions of dollars that are, you know, that know where to get greater profit, which is going to be through supporting the giants that are tearing apart and manipulating life more and more.
I think that a part of our low self-esteem as a species, honestly, has some of its roots in Christianity, in which, you know, we were born into original sin. And so in terms of looking at this contrast between paradigms, you know, we say in my people, we were born into beauty. And the grandmother, one of the grandmothers that I had an opportunity to meet, she said, now remember this, you know, this is the truth. You were born into beauty, as beauty, for joyful life, and that's the truth. You were born into beauty, as beauty, for joyful life. That's the truth. So I just keep that as sort of a guiding beacon out in front of me at all times, and know that that I can trust myself completely, and that I can love myself unconditionally. And the more I do that, the more the way of life is open to me. So, and then of course also the more I can do that for myself, the more I can do that for everybody around me.
Yes, absolutely perfect. I love it. And this original sin, you know, I won't include what I'm saying in the write-up, but, you know, it extends into just at every level this idea of progress. You know, you've got to constantly self-improve. So, you know, nothing is perfect the way it is. And that, I think, was what I learned out there was, no, things are pretty perfect as they are. And it's about, you know, and it includes everything around us and myself. So there's just such a contentedness in what is. And this is the opposite of fear. You know, even I wrote about that in Ancient Futures. Even when there's a baby in the womb, people are afraid, are they going to get into a good school, you know, signing up before they're born, because of this fear that they won't succeed and end up on top. You know.
When in fact we were born into fearless generosity and radical abundance. So.
Yes, and beauty. Yeah, absolutely. So lovely to have a chance to talk to Pat. And
yeah, it's great to talk to you as well.
Yeah, and I'd love to be part of any of those conversations. Let me know.
Great, I will.
Yeah, much love.